Audio log. Recovered MBITR transmission. Encrypted. Location, Sector 4, the Sahel time. T-000.10 to abandonment. Viper 1, this is Havoc Actual. We have a thermal bloom on your 6, battalion strength. You need to move to the LZ, now. Negative, Havoc. The bird can't hold the weight with the HVT and the wounded. The density altitude is too high. Damn it, Elara. Get your ass down here. We are not leaving you. Lieutenant, look at your fuel gauge. You lift with me, you crash. You leave now, you save the team. There is no third option. Viper, I am ordering you. Order declined. I'm spiking the scope. Tell my sister Sound of a bolt cycling. A singular, deafening crack of a .50 caliber round. Elara! Pilot, lift off! That's a direct order! Lift off! Rotor wash drowns out screaming. Static ensues. Target down! I'm empty! Good luck, boys! Transmission ends. 0900 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel Heat Index, 46 degrees, 115 degrees. Elevation, 1200 AGL. The desert did not scream, it hummed. A low, vibrating frequency of heat that distorted light and bent reality. Chief Petty Officer Elara Vance lay motionless on the limestone shelf, her body pressed into the jagged rock, like a fossil in the making. She was a singular organism of canvas, Kevlar, and sweat. Her breathing was shallow, a conscious biological rhythm designed to keep her heart rate under 60 beats per minute, despite the oven-like temperature. Viper, this is Havoc Actual. Radio check. The earpiece crackled, the voice of Lieutenant Brody sounding tinny and distant. Havoc, Viper, 5 by 5, Vance whispered. Her lips barely moved. The boom microphone of her headset caught the vibration of her throat rather than the breath of her mouth. Status? We are at the breach point. 2 mics out. How's the neighborhood? Vance shifted her eye to the rubber cup of the spotting scope. The world magnified 40 times. Down in the valley, the village of Al-Fashir was a cluster of mud brick squares and corrugated iron sheets. Heat waves shimmied off the roofs, making the donkeys and market stalls look like they were underwater. Quiet, Vance reported. Too quiet. No military-age males in the market. Livestock is penned. Local populace is indoors. Copy that. Spooked? Or prepared, Vance corrected. She panned the optic left, scanning the ridgeline opposite her position. Wind value is full value, left to right, 8 miles per hour. Picking up dust devils in Sector 2. She moved her hand millimeters to adjust the turret on her Macmillan TAC-50. The rifle was a beast, a bolt-action anchor capable of deleting a threat from 2 kilometers away. Today, the distance was only 800 meters, but the angle was steep, 30 degrees down. The math of the shot required trigonometry, physics, and intuition. We're going in, Brody said. Eyes on. Eyes on. Vance watched through the scope as the stack of 6 SEALs moved along the southern wall of the target compound. They were fluid, silent shadows in the harsh light. Their target, a warlord named Malik, responsible for the execution of 3 aid workers a week prior. Movement. High in the minaret of the village mosque, a flash of something unnatural. Not the dull glint of sun on stone, but the sharp reflection of a lens. Havoc, hold, Vance hissed. Holding. What do you have? Movement in the tower, Sector North, high angle. Vance narrowed her eyes. The heat shimmer made it difficult to resolve. She focused her breathing. Inhale, exhale, pause. The shimmer stabilized for a fraction of a second. A barrel. An RPG-7 aimed not at the approaching SEAL team, but at the empty courtyard they were about to cross. It was a pre-sighted kill zone. Ambush, Vance said, her voice dropping an octave. RPG in the tower. They're waiting for you to cross the courtyard. Copy. Can you take the shot? Vance checked her data. The wind was picking up, gusting now. The shot was tricky, through a narrow window, at an upward angle for the rocket, downward for her. If she missed, the rocket would fly, and half the team would be pink mist. If she fired, every gun in the valley would know exactly where she was. Negative on the suppression, Vance said, analyzing the geometry. I have to thread the needle. Do it, Viper. Clear the path. Elara Vance didn't hesitate. The decision had been made the moment she signed the contract. She was the guardian angel. Angels didn't get to be afraid of falling. She slid her finger inside the trigger guard. The pad of her index finger found the curve of the steel. She exhaled, emptying her lungs until there was nothing left but stillness. The reticle settled on the shadowed slit of the minaret. 1, 2, crack. The recoil shoved her shoulder backward, a violent kick that threw up a puff of dust around her position. She cycled the bolt immediately, clack, clack, chambering a fresh .50 caliber round before the brass casing of the first one hit the rocks. Through the scope, she saw the result. The RPG warhead detonated inside the tower, a bloom of orange fire and black smoke blowing the top of the minaret apart. Good effect on target, she said, her voice flat. Moving! Go! 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 Brody shouted over the comms. Down below, the village erupted. Gunfire sparked from windows and doorways. The silence was dead. The hum of the desert was replaced by the staccato rhythm of chaos. Viper, take out the technical on the east road. Copy. Vance shifted her aim. She had revealed her position. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was just physics and speed. But as she lined up the engine block of the approaching truck, she felt a change in the air pressure on the back of her neck. The wind wasn't just gusting. The sky to the north had turned a bruised, ugly purple. Havoc, Vance said, firing and watching the truck careen into a wall. We have a problem. Weather is turning. Major Hayboob inbound. ETA 10 mics. We have the package. We're moving to extract. Copy. Get to the LZ, I'll cover. She didn't know it yet, but the storm wasn't just bringing sand. It was bringing a decision that would strip her of her rank, her name, and her humanity. The extraction bird was coming, but the math of war was about to change. 38. She whispered to herself, a habit she had, counting the rounds left in her reserve. By the end of the week, that number would mean something entirely different. SO 925 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel Heat Index, 48 Toxicixer, 118 Multig. Status compromised. The run from the ridge to the extraction zone was a blur of lung-burning exertion. Elara Vance moved with the fluid desperation of an animal being hunted. Her TAC-50 rifle slammed against her back, the heavy barrel bruising her spine with every stride. Behind her, the village of Al-Fashir was a hornet's nest. The single shot she had fired to initiate the raid had been answered by hundreds. The air snapped with the supersonic cracks of AK-47 rounds passing too close. Havoc! Viper is at the rendezvous! Pop smoke! She screamed into her throat mic, sliding down a scree slope of loose shale. Smoke is out! Green smoke! Lieutenant Brody's voice was jagged, breathless. Ahead, in a depression between two dunes, a plume of emerald smoke fought against the rising wind. The sky was no longer blue. It was a wall of brown, churning earth. The Haboob was minutes away, a tsunami of sand 5,000 feet high, swallowing the horizon. Through the haze, the dark shape of the MH-60M Blackhawk materialized, banking hard. It was coming in hot, flaring its nose up to bleed speed. Vance hit the flat ground and sprinted. She saw her team, 6 men dragging a hooded figure. the warlord Malik. Malik was fighting them, dead weight, forcing 2 SEALs to drag him through the sand. Another SEAL, Miller, was limping, blood dark on his thigh. "Suppressing!" Vance yelled, dropping to a knee 10 meters from the rotor wash. She brought her rifle up, not the bolt-action monster on her back, but her carbine, an MK-18. She unleashed short, controlled bursts at the ridgeline where insurgents were cresting. Pop, pop, pop. One figure dropped. Pop, pop. Another ducked. The Black Hawk touched down, but not fully. The pilots kept the power up, skids hovering inches off the shifting sand. The heat was immense. The engine exhaust mixed with the desert air, creating a suffocating vacuum. "Load up! Load up!" The crew chief screamed from the open door, waving frantically. Brody and the team heaved Malik into the cabin. The warlord was screaming curses, kicking at the door gunner. Miller was shoved in next, groaning. The rest of the team piled in, a mass of limbs and gear. Vance was the last one. She stood up, shielding her eyes from the stinging sand, and ran for the door. As she reached for the handle, the helicopter lurched. It dropped heavily, the skids slamming into the sand. The turbine engine whined, a high-pitched scream of mechanical protest. "We're too heavy!" The pilot's voice cut through the comms, panic edging into the professional calm. "Temperature is 48 degrees. I'm maxing out torque. I can't get lift." Vance froze with one boot on the skid. She looked inside. The cabin was packed. 7 big men, 1 prisoner, heavy kit, and a full fuel load for the long flight back. The air was too thin, too hot. The physics simply didn't work. Bullets began to ping off the fuselage. Ping, thwack. "Dump the fuel!" Brody yelled. "Negative! We won't make the FARP!" The pilot shouted back. "We need to lose weight or we're sitting ducks!" Vance looked at the pilot's eyes through his visor. She saw the terror there. He was pulling the collective with everything he had. But the bird was sluggish, wallowing in its own downwash. The enemy fire was intensifying. An RPG zipped past the tail rotor, missing by feet. If they stayed another 30 seconds, the RPGs would find their mark. They would all burn. Vance looked at Brody. He was reaching a hand out to her, his face covered in sweat and grime. "Elara, get in. Give me your hand." She looked at the space inside. There was no room. Even if she squeezed in, the weight of her gear, the 50-pound rifle, the ammo, the plates, would be the straw that broke the camel's back. She stepped down from the skid. "Viper, what are you doing?" Brody screamed. "You can't lift with me, Lieutenant," Vance said. Her voice was strangely calm, a counterpoint to the chaos. "Check your torque. You're at 105%. You need to drop 300 pounds to get out of the ground effect." "No, we are not leaving you." Brody unbuckled his safety belt, trying to lunge toward the door. Vance raised her MK-18, not at the enemy, but pointed safely at the sky, stepping back 3 paces. She shook her head. "Pilot, lift off! That is a direct order! Save the package!" She barked over the net. "Elara!" "Go!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. "I'll hold them off! Go!" She turned her back on the helicopter. She dropped to a prone position, facing the oncoming wave of insurgents. She started firing, controlled, precise. Crack. Crack. Behind her, the pitch of the rotors changed. The engine note deepened as the pilot used the sudden drop in weight to pull the machine into the air. The wash blasted Vance, burying her partially in sand. She didn't look back. She couldn't. "I'm sorry, Elara," the pilot whispered over the radio. "Just fly," she murmured. The sound of the helicopter faded, swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Then, the storm hit. It wasn't a gradual arrival. The wall of sand slammed into her like a physical blow, blotting out the sun. The world went from bright white to a suffocating, rusty twilight in seconds. Visibility dropped to 0. Vance stopped firing. There was nothing to shoot at. The insurgents were blind, just as she was. She lay in the sand, the grit filling her mouth, her nose, her ears. The adrenaline crash hit her all at once, leaving her limbs trembling. She was alone, truly, completely alone in the devil's anvil. She reached for her radio, the embaitar on her chest rig. "Havoc, this is Viper. Status?" Static. She checked the frequency. Nothing. She checked the antenna. It was sheared off at the base, likely from a stray round or the impact of her dive. She had one magazine in her carbine, her pistol, her knife, and the heavy TAC-50 with 19 rounds left. She rolled onto her back, staring up into the swirling brown void. She didn't cry. Tears were water, and water was life. She couldn't afford to waste it. "Okay," she whispered to the storm. "Let's play." She keyed her internal emotional dampeners, a mental exercise she had learned in training. Fear was a reaction. Courage was a decision. Survival was just a series of tasks. Task 1. Get off the X. The enemy knew exactly where the helicopter had been. They would be sweeping this area with bayonets in minutes, storm or no storm. Elara Vance rolled over, dragged her heavy rifle through the dirt, and began to crawl. She didn't crawl away from the enemy. She crawled perpendicular to their line of advance, moving toward the rock formations that everyone else avoided. The hunt had begun. So 940 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel Heat Index, 47 degrees, 116 degrees. Status under indirect fire. The desert erupted. It started with a soft thump in the distance, a sound almost swallowed by the howling wind of the sandstorm. Vance knew that sound. It was the distinctive report of an 82mm mortar dropping into its tube. Flash to bang. She started counting automatically. 1001, 1002. The first round impacted 50 meters to her left. The ground heaved. A geyser of sand and shale sprayed into the air, turning the brown haze of the storm into a choking gray cloud of pulverized rock. The concussion wave slapped her chest, knocking the wind out of her. "Bracketing!" she hissed, spitting grit. They weren't aiming at her specifically. They couldn't see her in this visibility. They were gridding the extraction zone, walking explosive rounds back and forth to ensure nothing survived the botched pickup. Vance scrambled on her elbows and knees, keeping her profile lower than the rocks around her. She dragged the heavy drag bag containing her TC-50 with one hand. Her MK-18 gripped white-knuckled in the other. Thump, thump, thump. 3 tubes now. Battery fire. The next round landed closer. The sound was deafening, a physical pressure that popped her ears. Shrapnel whizzed overhead like angry hornets, slicing through the dry scrub brush. One jagged piece of hot metal struck the ceramic plate on her back, shoving her face first into the dirt. She didn't feel pain, just the blunt force trauma of the impact. She couldn't outrun the barrage. The haboob limited her vision to 5 feet, and the mortars were random death falling from the sky. She rolled into a shallow depression under a shelf of limestone, curling her body into the fetal position to protect her vital organs. She pulled the hood of her desert variant ghillie suit over her head. The suit was a masterpiece of camouflage. Strips of burlap, jute, and synthetic twine dyed to match the spectrum of the Sahel sand. Right now, it was her only armor. The earth shook rhythmically for 10 minutes. Vance lay still, her mouth open to equalize the pressure in her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. Every explosion vibrated through her skeleton. She thought of her daughter, Maya. She thought of the soccer game she was missing on Saturday. She forced those thoughts into a mental box and locked it. Focus. Survive. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the shelling stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the ringing, hollow silence of the aftermath. The wind still howled, but the mechanical violence had ceased. Vance didn't move. A rookie would have gotten up to check for damage. A veteran knew what the silence meant. Check fire. Infantry advance. They had softened the target. Now they were coming to check the bodies. Vance slowly lifted her head. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched tinnitus. She checked her limbs. Fingers moved. Toes moved. No wet warmth spreading on her uniform. She was intact. She pulled the broken MBITR radio from her vest. The casing was cracked, the screen dead. She toggled the switch. Nothing, no static, no hiss, just a dead brick of plastic. She was truly off the grid. No satellite overwatch, no drone feed, no voice to tell her she was going to be okay. She looked at the sand around her. The storm was depositing fresh layers of dust every second. If she moved now, she would leave a trail. If she stayed, they would stumble over her. She heard voices. They were shouting in Arabic, guttural and aggressive, cutting through the wind. They were close, maybe 50 meters. The sounds of boots crunching on gravel. Vance made a decision. She couldn't fight a battalion. She had to disappear. She utilized the terrain. The limestone overhang she was hiding under had a deep crevice at its base, filled with wind-blown drift sand. She didn't climb out. She dug in. Using her hands like spades, she hollowed out a trench in the soft drift, sliding her body backward into the earth. She pulled the drag bag on top of her legs, covering it with loose shale. Then she laid back, pulling the edges of her ghillie suit over her chest and face, allowing the blowing sand to do the rest. Within minutes, she was buried. Only the barrel of her Mk-18 and a small tunnel for vision remained clear, obscured by the veil of her suit. The voices grew louder. 2 pairs of boots walked into her field of view. They were wearing sandals and mismatched fatigues. One carried an AKM, the other had a radio on his hip. They stopped 10 feet from her face. Vance stopped breathing. She slowed her heart rate, a biofeedback technique she had perfected during sniper school. Be a rock. Be the sand. You are not here. The man with the radio spoke. Nothing. Just blood. He pointed to the spot where Miller had been dragged into the chopper. The witch is dead. The other man spat, kicking at a piece of shrapnel. The mortars turned her to dust. Commander Holloway said to bring the head. We keep looking. Holloway. The name hit Vance like a bullet. Colonel Holloway, her commanding officer, the man who sat in the JOC, Joint Operations Center, with air conditioning and coffee. Why would an insurgent know his name? The realization chilled her blood more than the desert night ever could. This wasn't just a failed extraction. This was a transaction. The men lingered for another eternity. One of them lit a cigarette, the ash blowing in the wind, landing inches from Vance's buried eye. She didn't blink. She stared past the ash, past the boots, fixing her gaze on nothing. Finally, they moved on, their voices fading into the swirl of the storm. Vance exhaled, a tiny puff of air that barely disturbed the sand covering her lips. She was alive, but the world she thought she was fighting for had just shattered. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She was loose ends. She waited until true darkness fell, until the temperature dropped and the storm began to settle into a low, grinding dust haze. Then, slowly, The ground began to move. The ghost rose from the grave. 1400 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel Heat Index, 50 degrees, 122. Status: critical dehydration. The sun was not a celestial body anymore. It was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Elara Vance had been moving for 6 hours since first light. The sandstorm had died down to a fine, suspended grit that coated the back of her throat like sandpaper. She had transitioned from the open dunes into the jagged, rusted teeth of the Devil's Anvil, a geological nightmare of basalt and limestone that trapped heat and radiated it back outward. She paused in the shadow of a balanced rock, checking her pulse. It was thready and fast. Too fast. Her skin had stopped sweating an hour ago, a dangerous sign. The body was hoarding moisture, shutting down non-essential cooling systems to keep the organs alive. She unclipped the hose of her camelback and bit down on the valve. She sucked hard. Nothing but warm air and the plastic taste of emptiness. She dropped the hose. "Check map," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasps, like dead leaves dragging over pavement. She pulled the laminated map from her thigh pocket. The Jaiba markers were grease pencil smears. She was navigating by dead reckoning now, counting paces and checking the sun's angle. If her intel was right, intel provided by the same command that had just tried to kill her, there were seasonal aquifers in these rocks. Old smuggler routes used to move opium and weapons across the border. Below her position, the sound of engines drifted up. Vance flattened herself against the rock. Through the shimmering heat haze, she saw them. 3 Toyota Hilux Technicals painted in desert tan, mounting DSK heavy machine guns in the beds. They were sweeping the wadi floor, moving slowly. They were hunting. She watched them through the unpowered scope of her TAC-50. The men in the back were scanning the cliffs with binoculars. They looked relaxed, confident. They knew she had no water. They didn't need to shoot her. They just had to wait for the desert to finish the job. Vance pushed off the rock and continued climbing. She had to get higher. Heat rose, but the wind was up there too. As she crested a ridge, the world tilted. The horizon line bent at a 45-degree angle. She stumbled, her knee slamming into the shale. "Mommy?" The voice was clear as a bell. Vance froze. She looked up, standing 10 meters away, wearing a bright yellow sundress and clutching a stuffed rabbit, was her 7-year-old daughter, Maya. "Mommy, are you thirsty?" Maya asked, tilting her head. Vance blinked. The image didn't vanish. It was perfect. She could see the scuff mark on Maya's left shoe. She could see the gap in her front teeth. "Maya?" Vance croaked, reaching a hand out. "Baby?" "Come on," Maya said, turning and skipping toward a dark fissure in the canyon wall. "It's cool inside." Vance shook her head violently. The movement made her vision swim with black spots. Hypoxia, heat syncope. It's not real. But her body moved on its own. She followed the hallucination. She crawled over razor-sharp scree, her boots sliding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Maya stood at the entrance of a narrow crack in the rock face, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. "In here," the girl whispered. And then she dissolved into a cloud of dust. Vance stared at the empty space. Tears pricked her eyes, but she had no moisture to shed. She looked at the crack. It was real. A deep, jagged shadow that the sun couldn't touch. She squeezed inside. The temperature dropped immediately. It was 20 degrees cooler in the shade. The silence was absolute. She turned on her tactical light, the beam cutting through the gloom. It wasn't just a crack. It was a cave. The floor was covered in goat droppings and old trash, rusted cans of Russian beef, discarded shell casings, cigarette butts. Smugglers had been here, but not recently. She moved deeper, drawn by a smell. It was faint, earthy, and damp. At the back of the cave, water dripped from a stalactite into a natural stone basin. It wasn't a pristine spring. The pool was covered in a film of green algae. Dead insects floated on the surface. It smelled of sulfur and rot. To Elara Vance, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She collapsed next to the pool. She didn't scoop it up immediately. Discipline warred with instinct. If she drank too fast, she would vomit, and losing those fluids would kill her. If the water was poisoned, she would die in agony. She pulled a purification tablet from her survival tin, one of the few pieces of kit she had left. She dropped it into her canteen cup, scooped up the green water, and waited. 5 minutes. She stared at the floating particulate. She thought of Holloway. She thought of the men in the technicals laughing. Anger was a fuel, but water was life. She lifted the cup. The water tasted like swimming pool chlorine mixed with mud. She took a sip, swallowed, waited. Her stomach cramped, then settled. She drank the rest. She refilled the cup. Then she refilled the Camelback, forcing the bladder under the drip until it was half full. She sat back against the cold cave wall, shivering as her body temperature began to regulate. She was safe for the moment. She had water. She had high ground. She had a choke point entrance that she could defend with a single knife. She pulled the bolt from her TAC 50 and began to clean the sand from the action with a piece of torn rag. "Not today," she whispered to the darkness. "Not today." The hallucination of Maya was gone, but the clarity remained. They had left her to die of thirst. They had bet on the desert. They had bet wrong. 1900 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel temperature, 28 Xikan, 82 Kuwalugrasser. Status, hunter-killer night did not bring safety. It brought the wolves. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees with the setting sun, turning the stifling oven of the Devil's Anvil into a chilling freezer. Elara Vance lay prone on a limestone shelf overlooking a narrow choke point in the wadi. She had left her heavy TAC 50 back in the cave, hidden under a pile of loose shale. For this, the rifle was a liability. Too long, too heavy, and deafeningly loud. Tonight, she carried only her Sig Sauer P226 with 12 rounds in the magazine and her MK3 Mod 0 combat knife. She watched the green phosphorescent glow of the desert through her night vision monocular. It was an older generation PVS-14 she had salvaged, grainy and prone to blooming, but it gave her the edge. 3 heat signatures moved below. They were not regular militia. These men moved with purpose. They spaced themselves out, 10 meters between intervals. They didn't speak. They didn't smoke. They were trackers, likely mercenaries paid by the head. Vance checked the wind. It was blowing into her face, carrying their scent. Unwashed wool, gun oil, and the faint copper smell of cat. She needed what they had: an automatic rifle, ammunition, and most importantly, a radio that wasn't broken. She picked up a fist-sized rock she had placed next to her hand hours ago. She waited until the point man passed a large boulder that obscured him from his teammates for a split second. She threw the rock. It clattered against the canyon wall, 20 meters behind the rear guard. The effect was instantaneous. The 3 men dropped to a knee, weapons snapping toward the sound. They held the silence, listening. The leader signaled with a closed fist. "Hold." Then he pointed 2 fingers at the rear guard. "Check it." The rear man broke formation, moving slowly toward the noise, his AKM raised. The other two remained focused on the front. Vance slipped over the edge of the shelf. She didn't jump. She slid, controlling her descent with her boots against the rock face, silent as a spider. She landed in the soft sand directly behind the second man, who was still scanning the darkness ahead. She didn't hesitate. Hesitation was death. She stepped into his shadow, her left hand clamping over his mouth, pulling his head back to expose the neck. Her right hand drove the combat knife downward, not across. The blade entered the soft hollow above the collarbone, severing the subclavian artery and piercing the lung. He didn't scream. He made a wet, gurgling sound as his lungs filled with blood. His body convulsed, thrashing against her. Vance held him tight, absorbing his struggles, her face pressed against his sweaty head wrap. This was not the clean, mathematical distance of sniping. This was intimate. It was warm, wet, and smelled of iron. She felt his life drain out of him, the spasms slowing until he went limp in her arms. She lowered him gently to the sand. Ahead, the point man turned, sensing the disturbance. "Ahmed," he whispered. Vance crouched behind the dead body, leveling her P-226 over the man's shoulder. The point man clicked on a tactical light, the beam sweeping the darkness. It hit the dead man's boots. The light jerked up, illuminating Vance's face, streaked with camouflage paint and dirt, eyes wide and cold. Pop, pop. The suppressed sound of the 9mm was swallowed by the canyon walls. The double tap hit the point man in the chest and the bridge of the nose. His light spun wildly as he fell backward, his rifle clattering against the stones. "Contact!" The third man shouted from the rear, opening fire blindly into the dark. Bullets cracked overhead, sparking off the granite. Vance rolled right, away from the dead body, diving into the cover of a large boulder. She was pinned. She had 10 rounds left. The third man was spraying the area, suppressing her position. "Come out, bitch!" the man screamed in broken English. "I see you!" He didn't see her. He was terrified. He was firing at shadows. Vance breathed. She waited for the rhythm. Burst. Pause. Burst. Pause. He was dumping his magazine. Click. The distinct metallic sound of a dry weapon. Vance surged forward. She didn't shoot. She closed the distance in 3 strides, rounding the boulder just as the man was fumbling to reload his AKM. He looked up, eyes widening in shock. He saw a demon rising from the dark, a small, fierce figure in a ghillie suit. He swung the rifle like a club. Vance ducked under the swing, driving her shoulder into his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping. She swept his legs, dropping him to the hard ground. Before he could recover, she had the muzzle of her pistol pressed against his forehead. "Quiet," she whispered. The man froze, his hands raised in surrender. He was young, barely 20. His eyes darted from her face to the gun. "Radio," she demanded, gesturing with her chin to the pouch on his vest. "Give me the radio." He reached slowly for the pouch, but as his hand moved, his eyes flickered to the knife she still held in her left hand, dripping with his friend's blood. Panic overrode his logic. He lunged for a grenade on his belt. Vance squeezed the trigger. Pop, the body went slack. Vance stood over him, her chest heaving. The silence rushed back into the wadi, heavier than before. She holstered her pistol. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump. She looked at the 3 bodies. They were someone's sons, someone's brothers. "Sorry," she whispered. She began to strip the bodies, She took the AKM from the point man. It was cleaner. She took 4 magazines. She took a canteen. And finally, she unclipped the radio from the last man's vest. It was an ICOM ICV-8, a rugged handheld used by insurgents. It was battered, but the power light was green. She clipped it to her gear. She had a voice now. She had a rifle that could lay down volume. She grabbed the supplies and melted back into the shadows, leaving the dead to the desert. The sniper was gone. The guerrilla fighter had been born. 2215 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel, temperature 18 degrees, 64 degrees. Status, ghost in the machine. The cave was a womb of absolute darkness, save for the faint, sickly green glow of the ICOM ICV-8's LCD screen. Elara Vance sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, the captured radio resting on her knees like a holy relic. Her hands, stained with dried blood and gun oil, moved with delicate precision over the keypad. She was shivering, the sweat from the day's exertion freezing on her skin as the desert temperature plummeted. "Come on," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Talk to me." The ICOM was a simple VHF transceiver, the kind used by taxi drivers and insurgents. It lacked the crypto keys to interface with the SEAL team's MBITR network. She couldn't just call Latan Brody, but she knew the fallback protocols. In the event of catastrophic comms failure, air assets would monitor specific unencrypted guard frequencies for distress beacons. She tuned the dial to 156 to 800 MHz, international distress. Nothing but static. She tried 121,500 MHz, civilian air guard, static. She pressed the squelch button, listening to the white noise of the electromagnetic spectrum. Every second the radio was on, it was draining the battery. She had maybe 2 hours of life left in the pack. She began to scan. If there was a drone overhead, a Reaper or a Predator, it might be broadcasting a downlink on a side channel. It was a long shot, a desperate prayer to the god of radio waves. Hiss, pop, hiss. Then, a voice. It was faint, cutting through the interference like a jagged knife. It wasn't Arabic, it was English. American English. "Station, this is Overlord, confirming BDA on grid reference Sierra 4. Vance's heart hammered against her ribs. Overlord. That was the call sign for the Joint Special Operations Command element running this op. She brought the radio closer to her ear, pressing the volume key. She didn't dare transmit yet. She needed to verify. "Overlord, this is Reaper 6 Actual," a pilot's voice responded, sounding bored, mechanical. "We have thermal on the village, no movement. The target area is cold." "Copy, Reaper. Status of the primary asset? Viper 1. Vance's breath hitched. That was her. They were looking for her. Relief washed over her so intensely it almost made her dizzy. They hadn't left her. They were scanning for her heat signature. She reached for the push-to-talk, PTT button. Her thumb hovered over the rubber switch. All she had to do was click it and scream her name. "I'm here. I'm alive." But something in the Overlord operator's tone stopped her. It wasn't the frantic urgency of a rescue coordinator. It was the clipped, bureaucratic tone of a logistics officer managing inventory. "Reaper, be advised." The voice, unmistakably Colonel Holloway's voice now, stepping onto the line, cut in. "Viper 1 is classified KIA. The extraction was compromised. We are scrubbing the operation." Vance froze. Her thumb trembled over the button. "KIA? I'm right here." "Copy, Overlord," the drone pilot replied. "We have a potential heat bloom in the rock formation north of the LZ. Could be a survivor. Requesting permission to investigate." There was a pause, a long, heavy silence that stretched for 5 seconds. "Negative, Reaper. Holloway's voice returned, colder than the cave air. That sector is hostile controlled. Intelligence indicates the asset was executed upon capture. We cannot risk another airframe for a body recovery. Your orders are to sanitize the intelligence leak. If you see movement in that sector, it is hostile. You are free to engage. Repeat, free to engage. Elara Vance stared at the little green screen. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Executed upon capture. Free to engage. He wasn't looking for her. He was ensuring she didn't come back. The mission to capture Malik had been off the books. Black Ops. If it went wrong, it didn't exist. And if the primary witness survived to tell the story of how she was abandoned to save a political reputation, that was a problem. A problem that a Hellfire missile could solve. Copy, Overlord, the pilot said, the boredom unchanged. Sanitizing the grid, engaging all targets of opportunity. Vance slowly lowered the radio. The betrayal didn't burn, it froze. It started in her gut and spread to her extremities, numbing the pain in her blistered feet and the ache in her back. The grief she had felt for her team, the hope she had held for rescue, it all calcified in that instant. She looked at the PTT button. If she spoke now, if she begged for her life, Holloway would just order the drone to drop a bomb on the source of the transmission. She was not a soldier anymore. She was a target. "You want me dead, Colonel?" she whispered to the glowing plastic box. She popped the battery latch and ripped the power source out of the radio, plunging the cave back into absolute darkness. "Then come and get me." She sat in the blackness, listening to the distant hum of the drone engine high above the clouds. They thought she was a loose end. They thought she was a tragedy to be filed away in a redacted folder. They forgot what she was. She wasn't just a sniper. She was a Tier 1 asset trained to survive in hell. She reached into the dark, and her hand found the cold steel of the stolen AKM. She racked the bolt. The sound was loud, angry, and final. The survivor died in that cave. The ghost was born. 0530 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel Heat Index, 36 degrees, rising. Status, counter-offensive dawn broke like a bruised peach over the jagged skyline of the Devil's Anvil. The light did not bring warmth. It brought exposure. Elara Vance sat motionless on a high outcropping, her stolen AKM resting across her knees. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was waiting. Through the cracked lens of the captured binoculars, she watched them come. They were 8 men. Unlike the undisciplined militia she had killed in the Wadi, these men moved with a terrifying fluidity. They wore indigo tagelmusts wrapping their faces, leaving only their eyes visible. They didn't march. They flowed over the rocks. Tuaregs, the blue men of the desert. Mercenaries born in the sand, who could track a lizard across a granite slab. They had found her false trail. She had left it intentionally. A broken twig here, a disturbed patch of gravel there. It was a breadcrumb trail leading straight into the Needle's Eye, a blind canyon with sheer walls rising 200 feet on 3 sides. "Come on," Vance whispered. Her lips were cracked, bleeding. She had spent the last 4 hours preparing the kill zone. It was a lesson she had learned in SEER school, refined by years of combat. If you cannot outrun the dog, you must break its legs. The point man of the Tuareg unit stopped. He crouched low, examining a scuff mark on the stone. He signaled to the man behind him. They were cautious. They knew they were hunting a sniper, not a lost tourist. Vance shifted her weight. She was positioned on the rim of the canyon, looking down into the funnel. Behind her, she had arranged a pile of loose boulders, held in place by a precarious wedge of driftwood she had jammed into a fissure. It was crude. It was primitive. It was perfect. The 8 men moved deeper into the canyon. They were scanning the lower caves, expecting her to be cornered like a rat in a hole. They didn't look up. The sun was rising directly behind Vance, blinding anyone who tried to scan the rim. She waited until the last man cleared the entrance of the gorge. Now. Vance stood up. She didn't fire her weapon. Instead, she kicked the driftwood wedge with the heel of her boot. Crack. The wood snapped. The physics of gravity took over. The first boulder, the size of an engine block, rolled forward. It hit the second, then the third. Within seconds, a cascading avalanche of rock and shale roared down the canyon wall. The sound was thunderous, echoing off the canyon walls, amplifying into a deafening roar. Down below, the discipline of the Tuaregs shattered. They looked up, screaming as the mountain came down on top of them. 3 men were crushed instantly, buried under tons of limestone before they could even raise their rifles. The dust cloud billowed up, obscuring the floor of the canyon in a choking white fog. Vance shouldered the AKM. She didn't wait for the dust to settle. She knew the geography of the kill zone. She knew where the survivors would run, to the far wall, seeking cover under the overhang. She flipped the selector switch to semi-automatic. She needed to be precise. She only had 3 magazines. A figure emerged from the dust, stumbling, coughing, his indigo robes gray with pulverized rock. Bang! The 7.62mm round struck him in the center of the chest. He dropped. Another man sprinted for the exit, firing wildly into the air. Vance led him slightly, tracking his movement. Bang! He crumpled mid-stride. "I see her! On the rim!" A voice screamed from the dust cloud. Bullets began to snap around Vance's position. They had spotted the muzzle flash. The survivors were returning fire, their rounds chipping the rock near her face. Shrapnel sliced her cheek, but she didn't flinch. She pulled the pin on a grenade she had taken from the Wadi patrol. She didn't throw it immediately. She held the spoon, counting. 1, 2. She lobbed it over the edge, aiming for the cluster of muzzle flashes below. The grenade fell through the air, disappearing into the dust. Crump. The explosion was muffled but violent. The firing from below stopped. Vance scanned the canyon floor. The dust was beginning to drift away on the morning breeze. Bodies lay scattered among the rocks. There was no movement, no groans, just the stillness of the grave. She lowered the rifle. Her heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. She felt no remorse. These men were professionals. They played the game, and they lost. But as she watched, one figure stirred. It was the leader. He was pinned under a rock, his legs crushed, but he was dragging himself forward with his arms, reaching for his fallen rifle. Vance watched him through the sights. She could end it now. 1 round. She lowered the barrel. No. She needed them to find him. She needed Holloway to know that his elite trackers hadn't just failed. They had been dismantled. She stood up, silhouetted against the blinding sun, letting the dying man see her. She wanted him to see the ghost that had done this. She raised a hand in a mock salute, then turned and vanished back into the labyrinth of the Devil's Anvil. She wasn't running anymore. She was hunting, and she was just getting started. EO 700 Zulu, Al Sara Air Base, Allied TOC temperature 20 degrees C, climate controlled. Status: administrative deadlock. The Joint Operations Center smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and lies. Lieutenant Brody stood before the wall of monitors, His arms crossed so tightly across his chest that his knuckles were white. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. The grit of the extraction zone was still under his fingernails, a physical reminder of the woman he had left in the sand. "We go back," Brody said, his voice low and dangerous. "We have the bird fueled. We have the team prepped. Give me the green light, Colonel." Colonel Holloway didn't look up from his tablet. He sat at the elevated command desk, the artificial light casting long shadows over his face. "Negative, Lieutenant. You know the situation. The region is unstable. The State Department is already breathing down my neck about the mosque you blew up." "We didn't blow it up," Brody snapped. "The hostile RPG did, and we left a Tier 1 asset behind to make that extraction happen." "Chief Vance is KIA, Lieutenant," Holloway said, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, bureaucratic flint. "We have the intercept. We have the heat bloom from the mortar barrage. She's gone. Risking 6 more men for a corpse is not a tactical decision. It's an emotional one. We don't leave people behind." Brody slammed his hand on the console, silencing the room. The analysts, young specialists glued to their screens, froze. "Dead or alive, we bring her home." "She is home," Holloway said softly. "She's part of the desert now. Stand down, Brody. That is a direct order. Process your team, write your statements, and get some sleep." Brody stared at the colonel. He wanted to reach across the desk and strangle the man. He felt the weight of Vance's sacrifice like a stone in his gut. She had cut the line. She had looked him in the eye and ordered him to fly. "Sir," a voice piped up from the ISR station. It was Technical Sergeant Miller, the drone operator. "You need to see this." Holloway sighed. What is it, Miller?" "Global Hawk is doing a damage assessment on the northern sector, the Needle's Eye ravine." "The restricted zone?" Holloway frowned. "I told you to sanitize the logs." "I did, sir, but the feed is live. Look." Brody stepped around the desk, crowding the monitor. On the screen, the grainy black and white thermal image showed the jagged scar of the ravine. There were bodies. White-hot blobs scattered across the canyon floor. "Insurgent infighting," Holloway dismissed. "Local tribes settling scores." "Zoom in," Brody commanded. Miller tapped the keyboard. The image magnified. The resolution sharpened. "Count them," Brody whispered. 8 tangos, Miller said. 7 confirmed kills, 1 squirming. "Look at the positioning." Brody pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "That's not a tribal skirmish. That's a rockslide trap. See the debris field? And look at the spacing of the shots. Center mass, double taps." He traced the line of fire back to the rim of the canyon. "Someone was up here," Brody said, his voice gaining strength. "Someone triggered that slide, waited for the dust, and then cleaned up the survivors." "A rival faction," Holloway insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Brody shook his head. "Insurgents spray and pray. They don't use force multipliers like terrain. They don't engage with this kind of discipline." He looked at Miller. "Rewind the feed, 2 hours." "Lieutenant, you are exceeding your authority," Holloway warned. "Do it!" Brody roared. Miller flinched, but obeyed. The timestamp rolled back. The screen flickered. There, for a split second, on the rim of the canyon, a figure stood up. The thermal signature was faint, masked by what looked like a ghillie suit, but the outline was unmistakable. The figure raised a hand toward the dying man in the canyon. A salute. Brody felt the air leave his lungs. Pause. The image froze. The figure was small, compact, carrying a weapon that looked like an AK, but holding it with the posture of a Western operator. Dead bodies don't shoot back, Colonel, Brody whispered. And they definitely don't salute. It's an anomaly, Holloway said, standing up. It's a glitch in the thermal sensor. Chief Vance is dead. This conversation is over. Brody turned slowly to face his commanding officer. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, hard rage. He realized then that this wasn't incompetence. Holloway knew. He knew she was alive, and he was leaving her there because her survival proved the mission was a catastrophe. You're right, sir, Brody lied, his face an unreadable mask. It's probably nothing. He signaled to Miller with a subtle tap on the shoulder. Save the footage. Miller gave a microscopic nod. Brody walked out of the JOC, his boots echoing on the linoleum. He didn't go to his bunk. He went straight to the team room where the rest of Viper Squad was, waiting. They looked up as he entered. They were cleaning weapons, their eyes hollow. Pack your bags, Brody said, grabbing his helmet. We got the green light? Jackson, the heavy weapons specialist, asked, hope sparking in his eyes. No, Brody said, ripping the patch off his shoulder, the unit insignia, and tossing it onto the table. We're going fishing. Without air support? We don't need air support, Brody said, pulling a map of Sector 4 from his pocket. We know where she is. She's not hiding from the enemy anymore. She's hunting them. And if we don't get there fast, there won't be anyone left to kill. He looked at the men who would follow him into hell. Wheels up in 10. We're going to get our girl. 1100 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel visibility, 0 status, close quarters battle. The world ended in a wall of brown. The second Haboob was not like the first. This was a monster, a towering cliff of electrified dust 3,000 feet high, driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds. It swallowed the sun, turning midday into a suffocating, rusty twilight. Elara Vance moved with it. She had wrapped a shima, taken from one of the dead Tuaregs, tightly around her face, leaving only a slit for her eyes. She wore the dead leader's tactical goggles, pressing them tight against her cheekbones to seal out the grit. She wasn't retreating to the caves this time. She was attacking. The enemy battalion, now 300 strong, had moved up the valley to cordon off the rock formations. They were expecting a sniper on the high ground. They were looking up. Vance was down in the dirt, walking right through their front door. The wind roared like a jet engine, drowning out all sound. Footsteps were silent. Shouts were lost. Vance moved by feel, her hand trailing along the rough mud brick wall of a ruined outlier building. She checked the thermal monocular she had scavenged from the Tuareg leader. It was a high-end French unit, but even it struggled against the wall of dust. The screen was awash of gray static, the suspended sand retaining heat and blinding the sensor. But every few seconds, darker, solid shapes would ghost through the haze. Heat signatures. Bodies. She turned a corner and slammed physically into a hard object. A chest. Vance recoiled, instinctively bringing the barrel of her stolen AKM up. The man she had bumped into shouted something unintelligible, grabbing at her. He thought she was one of his comrades, lost in the storm. Vance didn't speak. She drove the muzzle of the rifle into his gut and pulled the trigger. The noise was muffled by the wind and the contact. The man folded. The muzzle flash lit up the dust around them like a strobe light in a fog bank. For a split second, the scene was illuminated. She was standing in the middle of a courtyard packed with insurgents, 20 men, maybe 30. They were huddled against the walls, shielding their faces from the stinging sand, weapons slung low. The flash alerted them. Panic, instant and contagious, rippled through the group. "Contact! Inside! Contact!" Vance didn't stop moving. She was a shark in a bait ball. She pivoted left, firing from the hip. She didn't need to aim. The targets were everywhere. Bang, bang, bang. 2 men dropped. The insurgents panicked. Blinded by the dust and the sudden violence in their midst, they opened fire. AK-47s erupted in every direction. Green tracer rounds zipped through the brown haze, ricocheting off walls and tearing into flesh. They were shooting each other. Vance dropped to the ground, rolling toward a pile of rubble. She lay flat as the air above her became a kill zone of crossfire. Screams joined the howling wind. It was pure chaos, a meat grinder of their own making. She crawled forward, her knife in her left hand, the AK in her right. A pair of boots appeared in the dust in front of her. She hamstrung the fighter with the knife, slashing the back of his knee. As he fell, she finished him with a single round to the chest. She was counting. 6, 7. She moved again. Staying still meant getting hit by a stray round. She had to keep rotating, keeping the enemy confused, making them think they were surrounded by a squad rather than a single woman. She rose to a crouch, spotting a cluster of 3 men trying to set up a PKM machine gun. She pulled the pin on her last grenade and bowled it across the courtyard. Flash. Boom. The shockwave punched through the dust, clearing a small pocket of visibility for a heartbeat. Bodies lay scattered. Vance stepped through the smoke, firing controlled pairs. 10, 11, 12. She was winning. The psychological weight of the unseen attacker was crushing them. They were breaking, running into the storm, abandoning their weapons. She turned to exit the courtyard, her blood singing with the adrenaline of the kill. A shadow lunged from a doorway. She brought her rifle up, but she was a fraction of a second too slow. The insurgent, a massive man with a scarred face, swatted the barrel aside. In his other hand, a curved Jambia dagger flashed. Vance twisted, trying to dodge, but the blade caught her. It sliced through the canvas of her uniform and bit deep into the flesh of her left bicep. The pain was a white-hot line of fire. She grunted, dropping to one knee. The man raised the knife for a killing stroke. Vance didn't try to block. She dropped the AKM, letting it hang by its sling, and drew her Sig Sauer P226 from her drop-leg holster. She fired upward, point blank, under his chin. The man collapsed backward, dead before he hit the ground. Vance scrambled backward, clutching her arm. Blood was hot and slick against her skin, soaking the sleeve of her tunic instantly. The wound was deep. Muscle damage. The firefight in the courtyard was dying down. The survivors had fled or were dead. But the noise would draw the rest of the battalion. She had to move. She holstered the pistol and gripped her injured arm, forcing herself to stand. The world tilted. The blood loss combined with the heat and the exertion was tipping the scales. "Not yet," she hissed through gritted teeth. She retrieved her rifle, checking the magazine. Empty. She reloaded with a fresh one, her second to last. She turned her back on the carnage and limped into the howling void of the storm. She had thinned the herd, but the desert had taken its toll. She was bleeding, exhausted, and the adrenaline was fading, leaving only the sharp, throbbing reality of the knife wound. The ghost was hurt, and sharks could smell blood in the water. 1530 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel body temperature, 39.4 Taktiksu, 103 degrees F. Status, medical emergency pain, was a color. Right now it was a blinding, pulsating white that washed out the edges of her vision. Elara Vance stumbled down the crumbling stone steps of what used to be a root cellar. The sandstorm had passed, leaving the air still and heavy with suspended dust. Outside, the sounds of shouting men and revving engines grew louder. The hornet's nest was fully stirred. She collapsed against the cool earthen wall, sliding down until she hit the dirt floor. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, a dead weight of throbbing agony. The improvised tourniquet she had cinched, a strip of torn Velcro from her gear, was doing its job, but it couldn't stay on forever. If she left it tight, she'd lose the arm to necrosis. If she loosened it without sealing the wound, she'd bleed out. She clicked on her red lens tactical light, holding it in her teeth. She looked at the wound. It was bad. The jambia had sliced through the canvas of her uniform and the triceps muscle, exposing the pale, glistening fascia and the dark red meat beneath. It gaped like a second mouth, 3 inches long and deep. Sand and grit from the storm had already worked their way into the cut. "Okay," she whispered, the words slurring. "Okay." She touched her forehead. It was burning. The fever was already spiking, fueled by the dehydration and the trauma. The desert was a petri dish. Bacteria multiplied here at terrifying speeds. Sepsis would set in before midnight if she didn't close it. She checked her med kit. It was gone, ripped away during the extraction scramble or lost in the sand. She had no sutures, no morphine, no antiseptic. She looked at the magazine in her lap. "Old school," she murmured. A delirious giggle bubbled up in her throat, sounding foreign and terrified. She ejected a single 5.56mm round from the magazine. Using her knife, she pried the bullet tip from the casing, wiggling it until the copper jacket popped free. She carefully poured the granular propellant, gunpowder, onto a flat stone. She did this with 2 more rounds until she had a small pile of gray flakes. She picked up the stone. Her hand trembled uncontrollably. She forced herself to breathe, to find that cold, hard center that Holloway said made her a machine. "I am not a machine," she thought. "I am meat." She loosened the tourniquet. Blood welled up immediately, dark and sluggish. She gritted her teeth and poured the gunpowder directly into the open wound. The sting was instant, sharp and chemical, but it was nothing compared to what was coming. She grabbed a piece of leather scrap, part of her sling, and shoved it between her back teeth. She bit down hard, tasting salt and sweat. She took her lighter from her pocket. She flicked the wheel. A small, dancing yellow flame appeared. "Do it!" the voice in her head commanded. It sounded like, "Lilt Brody, don't think. Just do it." She brought the flame to her arm. Whoosh! The powder ignited. It wasn't a burn, it was a consumption. For a split second, the wound glowed orange. The heat was absolute, searing nerve endings, boiling blood, and fusing flesh together in a violent chemical reaction. Vance didn't scream. She couldn't. Her jaw clamped down on the leather so hard she felt a molar crack. Her back arched off the wall, every muscle in her body seizing in a rigid tetanic spasm. Her vision went black, then white, then red. The smell hit her next. The smell of cooking pork. The smell of herself. She slumped forward, gasping for air, tears streaming down her grime-streaked face. The world spun. "Mommy?" She blinked. Standing in the corner of the cellar, illuminated by the dying embers on her arm, was Maya. But it wasn't the Maya from the playground. It was Maya in a black funeral dress, holding a folded American flag. "Why didn't you come home?" the hallucination asked, her eyes empty. "I tried," Vance sobbed, her voice a broken whisper. "I tried, baby." "You're burning," Maya said. "You have to wake up. The bad men are here." Vance shook her head, trying to clear the image. The pain was receding into a dull, throbbing roar. She looked at her arm. The wound was an ugly charred ruin, black and crusty, but the bleeding had stopped. The vessel was cauterized. Above her, dust sifted down from the ceiling. Footsteps. Heavy boots walking on the floorboards overhead. Vance froze. The fever dream shattered. The predator instinct snapped back into place, overriding the shock. "Check the basement," a voice said in Arabic. Vance reached for her pistol with her right hand. Her left arm was useless, a fiery anchor dragging her down, but her right hand was still steady. She rolled onto her stomach, aiming at the wooden trapdoor at the top of the stairs. The handle turned. Sunlight sliced through the gloom as the door creaked open. A silhouette appeared. Vance didn't fire. She waited. She needed him to commit. She needed him to come down the steps so his body wouldn't block the light, so his friends wouldn't see him fall. The insurgent took one step down, then another. He was squinting into the dark. Vance squeezed the trigger. The suppressed round caught him in the throat. He gurgled, hands flying to his neck, and tumbled down the stairs, landing in a heap at her feet. Vance didn't move. She listened. "Hassan?" a voice called from above. Vance looked at the dead man. He had a bandage roll in his pocket, a pouch of water. She smiled, a grim, feverish baring of teeth. The delivery service had arrived. She crawled toward the body, dragging her burnt arm. She wasn't going to die here, not in a cellar, not today. She would bandage the wound, drink the water, and then she would kill them all. She was infected. Yes. But she was the infection. And she was spreading. 1645 Zulu, Yang Sector 4, Northern Sahel status, compromised, feverish ammo. Count, 18 rounds, 556 Malkers, 7 rounds, 9 Malters. The heat of the day was breaking, but the fever in Elara Vance's blood was climbing. She lay prone on the limestone ridge, the same position where she had started this nightmare 48 hours ago. Her left arm was a throbbing, charred ruin wrapped in dirty gauze taken from the dead man in the cellar. Every heartbeat sent a spike of agony through her shoulder, but the pain kept her awake. It kept the hallucinations of her daughter at bay. Through the scope of the AKM, a battered optic she had scavenged, she looked down into the village of Al-Fashir. The scene was a tableau of cruelty. The insurgent battalion, frustrated by the sandstorm and the invisible demon hunting them, had turned their rage on the locals. They had dragged the village elders and women into the central square. A technical with a heavy machine gun was parked at the gate, its barrel pointed at the kneeling civilians. A man in a black beret, a high-ranking commander, was shouting, pacing back and forth. He pointed at the mountains, then at the villagers. He pulled a pistol and placed it against the head of a teenage boy. "He wants me," Vance whispered, her throat dry as dust. "He thinks they're hiding me." She checked her magazine. 18 rounds. She had a pistol with 7. She had no grenades. She couldn't fight a battalion. If she engaged now, she might kill the commander. But the machine gun would cut the civilians to ribbons in retaliation. She needed to be louder than a rifle. She needed to be a dragon. She looked to her right. 5 meters away lay the body of the RPG gunner she had killed in the opening salvo of the operation days ago. The corpse was bloated, baking in the sun, but the RPG-7 launcher was still there, and next to it, a canvas bag containing 2 warheads. Vance crawled toward the body. She dragged herself over the sharp rocks, gritting her teeth against the pain in her arm. She reached the launcher. It was heavy, smelling of rust and old sweat. She checked the tube. Clear. She loaded a rocket, twisting it until it locked into place. The safety pin was stiff, but she yanked it free. "Hey!" she screamed. Her voice was raw, a cracked screech that didn't carry far. But she didn't need her voice to be heard. She needed her body to be seen. Elara Vance stood up. She stood fully upright on the highest point of the ridge, silhouetted against the setting sun. To the soldiers below, she was a black cutout against the orange sky, a defiance of every survival instinct she possessed. The commander in the square froze. He looked up. Hundreds of eyes followed his gaze. Vance hefted the RPG to her right shoulder. She didn't aim at the commander. She aimed at the fuel truck parked next to the mosque, the battalion's mobile resupply point. "Look at me," she yelled, though only the wind heard her. She squeezed the trigger. Whoosh! The launcher bucked against her shoulder. The rocket streaked down into the valley, a corkscrew of gray smoke trailing behind it. Vance dropped the tube and dived backward immediately. Boom! The fuel truck detonated with the force of a small tactical nuke. A fireball rolled upward, engulfing the two technicals parked next to it. The shockwave shattered windows and knocked the commander off his feet. The distraction was absolute. The machine gunner on the technical spun his weapon around, firing wildly at the ridge. The soldiers forgot the civilians. They forgot the boy. Their entire world narrowed to the figure on the cliff who had just punched them in the jaw. "Get to cover!" Vance screamed at the distant villagers, though she knew they couldn't hear. But they understood. In the chaos, the women grabbed the children and ran. The men scattered into the alleyways. The square emptied. Now the fire was coming for her. Bullets chewed up the limestone ledge where she had been standing seconds ago. Heavy caliber rounds smashed the rock into powder. Vance grabbed her AKM and scrambled into a low crouch, moving fast. She couldn't stay static. She had to lead them away from the village, deeper into the Devil's Anvil. She popped up 20 meters to the left. She saw a group of 5 insurgents sprinting up the slope, trying to flank her. She steadied the rifle against a boulder. Breathe. Squeeze. Bang. Bang. One fell. Bang. Another stumbled, clutching his leg. She was down to 15 rounds. "Come and get me," she hissed, turning and sprinting into a narrow ravine. She could hear them behind her. A roar of engines and shouting men. They were coming with everything they had. The technicals were revving, driving off-road to cut her off. The infantry was swarming up the slope like ants. She had saved the village, but she had just signed her own death warrant. She was herding 300 angry men into a box, and she was the prize inside. She reached into her pocket and touched the voice recorder she had taken from the Tuareg leader. It was her insurance, but she wouldn't need it if she was dead. She checked the sun. Less than an hour of light left. If she could survive until dark, she had a chance. If not, she would make them pay for every inch of ground in blood. She reloaded the RPG with the second and final warhead. She slung the tube across her back. It clanged against her spine, a heavy metallic bell tolling for the end. Vance ran. The desert stretched out before her, endless and indifferent. She was the bait, the hook, and the fisherman all at once. 1710, Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel, altitude, 20,000 FAO, threat, status, target designated. The sound was different from the drone. The drone was a lawnmower in the sky, a constant, annoying buzz. This was different. This was a tearing sound, like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped apart in the upper atmosphere. Elara Vance stopped running. She was halfway down the scree slope, sliding on loose shale, her lungs burning with every breath. Below her, 50 meters away, the lead elements of the insurgent pursuit force were clawing their way up the rocks. She could see their faces, contorted with rage, teeth bared. Bullets snapped past her ears, cracking against the stones. But Vance was looking up. She pulled the Tuareg leader's tactical goggles over her eyes. The world turned a grainy green. And there it was. A beam of pulsating light, invisible to the naked eye, was painting the ground 10 meters behind her. It was sparkling. The infrared energy of a laser designator dancing on the rocks. Someone was painting the target, and the target was her. "Halloway," she spat, the name tasting of bile. He wasn't sending a rescue chopper. He was sending a sanitizer. He was scrubbing the board. The tearing sound grew louder, dropping in pitch. A fast mover, an FA-18 or an F-16 diving for a delivery pass. Based on the laser lock, this wasn't a strafing run. This was heavy ordnance, a GBU, smart iron. She had seconds. The logic of war dictated that she should run away from the target point. But a GBU-31, a 2,000-pound joint direct attack munition, had a kill radius of 400 meters. There was no away. If she ran back up the ridge, she died. If she stayed here, she died. She looked down at the insurgents. They were clustered in a narrow depression, using the rocks for cover as they fired up at her. They didn't hear the jet. The adrenaline of the firefight deafened them. They didn't see the laser. Vance made the calculation. It was insane. It was suicide. It was the only chance she had. "Hug the belt," she screamed internally. It was an old Vietnam-era tactic. Get so close to the enemy that the artillery and air support couldn't hit you without killing their own troops. But in this case, she was using the enemy as a blast shield. She turned and sprinted downhill. She ran directly at the men trying to kill her. The lead insurgent, a bearded man with an RPK machine gun, froze. He had expected her to retreat. Seeing the ghost charge him with a blackened, useless arm and a manic expression broke his OODA loop. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Vance didn't shoot. She tackled him. She hit him with the force of a linebacker, driving her shoulder into his chest. They tumbled together over the lip of the depression, falling into the rocky hollow where the rest of his squad was taking cover. "Get down!" she roared in English, not that it mattered. She slammed the insurgent into the dirt and rolled underneath him, pulling his body on top of hers like a heavy, fleshy blanket. She curled into a ball, burying her face in the grit, pressing her hands over her ears. The insurgents around her shouted in confusion. One raised a rifle to shoot the woman lying beneath their comrade. Then the sky fell. Crack, boom. The impact was not a sound. It was a physical event. The bomb struck the ridgeline 50 meters above them, exactly where Vance had been standing when the laser locked on. The world turned white. The ground liquefied. The shock wave hit the depression like a hammer of God. It lifted the insurgents off their feet and threw them against the canyon walls. The air was sucked out of the hollow, replaced instantly by a wall of overpressure that shattered eardrums and collapsed lungs. Rocks the size of cars were tossed into the air like pebbles. A landslide of debris came crashing down, burying the hollow in dust and darkness. Vance felt the man on top of her jerk violently, his body absorbing the shrapnel and the primary blast wave. His blood sprayed hot over her neck. The weight of him pressed the air from her lungs. Then, darkness. The ringing in her ears was absolute. It was a silence so profound she thought she was dead. She lay there, crushed under the weight of the dead man and the falling earth. She waited for the pain, she waited for the final fade to black. But the pain was the same old pain. The burn on her arm, the bruises on her ribs. She wiggled her toes. They moved. She clenched her right hand. It worked. She was alive. The bomb had done exactly what she calculated. The depression had acted as a trench, shielding her from the horizontal fragmentation. The dead insurgent had acted as armor against the overpressure. Colonel Holloway had just dropped $1 million bomb to kill one witness. Instead, he had just wiped out the pursuit force that had her pinned down. Vance coughed, choking on the pulverized limestone dust. She shoved the heavy, limp body off her. It rolled away with a wet thud. She clawed her way up through the debris. Her head broke the surface of the rubble. The scene was apocalyptic. The ridge above was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. The slope was a moonscape of shattered rock and twisted metal. The insurgents who had been standing in the open were simply gone, vaporized. Those in the hollow with her were broken dolls, tossed against the rocks by the blast. Vance dragged herself free. She stood up, swaying, covered in gray dust and red blood. None of it hers, save for the weeping burn on her arm. She looked up at the sky. The jet was gone, banking away, mission accomplished. The pilot would report, good effect on target. Holloway would sign the paper. The book would be closed. Vance reached down and picked up her AKM from the rubble. The stock was cracked, but the action cycled. "You missed," she whispered to the empty sky. She turned to the south. The blast would attract every scavenger and soldier for 10 miles. But it had also bought her time. Everyone thought she was dead. The Americans thought she was vaporized. The insurgents thought she was blown to pieces. She was a ghost now in the truest sense. She began to walk, not running, walking, a steady, relentless pace. She wasn't trying to escape anymore. She was heading toward the extraction point, not to be rescued, to be waiting. 1830 Zulu, Sector 4, Northern Sahel. Status, hostile environment, visibility, twilight. The crater was still hot. The rocks glowed with a dull, malevolent heat in the fading light, clicking as they cooled. The air tasted of sulfur and pulverized limestone. Elara Vance lay buried in the loose scree on the crater's rim. She was indistinguishable from the debris. Her ghillie suit was shredded, her face a mask of dried blood and gray dust, her left arm a throbbing mass of charred flesh. She was no longer counting pain. She was operating on pure, distilled survival instinct. She heard the rotors before she saw them. It wasn't the heavy thump-thump of a rescue pavehawk. It was the high-pitched whine of a little bird, an MH-6, agile and quiet. The helicopter flared over the crater, kicking up a fresh cloud of ash. It touched down in the center of the blast zone. 4 men disembarked. Vance watched through the crack in the rocks. They weren't wearing standard multicam. They wore solid black fatigues, no insignia, no patches. They carried suppressed MP7 submachine guns, compact, lethal, close-quarters weapons. These weren't rescuers. They were janitors. "Fan out," the point man said. His voice was distorted by a gas mask. "Check for biomass. DNA confirmation required. If you find anything larger than a finger, bag it." "ROE on locals," another asked. "Sanitize. No witnesses." Vance gripped the pistol grip of her broken AKM. It had 1 round in the chamber and 3 in the magazine. She had her sidearm with 4 rounds. She watched as the cleaners moved through the carnage. They weren't checking pulses. They were putting insurance rounds into the broken bodies of the insurgents the bomb had killed. Foot. The suppressed shots were barely audible. They were moving toward her position. Vance calculated her odds. 4 highly trained operators against 1 wounded, exhausted sniper. 0%. She shifted her weight, preparing to die fighting. She would take at least 1 with her. Suddenly, a roar tore through the sky. A second helicopter, a massive MH-47 Chinook, crested the ridgeline, flying dangerously low. It didn't land. It hovered 10 feet off the deck, the ramp already down. Figures in desert digital camo leapt from the ramp, fast roping without the rope, dropping hard onto the rocks. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" a voice screamed. It was a lie, but it was a loud one. It was Brody. Vance's heart seized. "You idiot," she thought. "You came back." The 4 men in black spun around, bringing their MP7s up. The 6 men from the Chinook fanned out, M4s raised. "Stand down!" Brody yelled, advancing with his weapon shouldered. "This is a sanctioned recovery operation. Lower your weapons." "This is a restricted zone, Lieutenant," the leader of the Black Ops team said, his voice calm, icy. He didn't lower his gun. "You are interfering with a classified directive from the Joint Chiefs. Leave now, and you might keep your commissions." "I'm not leaving without my chief," Brody snarled. "Last warning, drop it." "Or what?" the cleaner sneered. "You going to shoot Americans, Brody? You going to start a war right here?" It was a stalemate, a Mexican standoff in the middle of hell. Fingers tightened on triggers. The air crackled with the terrifying possibility of fratricide. The cleaners knew Brody wouldn't fire first. The psychological barrier of shooting a fellow operator was too high. The cleaner leader took a step forward. "Your girl is vaporized, Brody. Look at this place. There's nothing left to save. Go home." He turned his back on Brody, dismissing him, and walked toward the pile of rocks where Vance was hiding. "Check that ridge," he ordered his men. Brody hesitated. The doubt was creeping in. The crater was massive. Could anyone have survived this? The cleaner leader stopped 3 feet from Vance's face. He looked down, scanning the debris. Vance opened her eyes. She didn't rise like a zombie. She exploded upward with the last reserves of her strength. She didn't use her gun initially. She used the element of total surprise. She kicked the cleaner's knee out from under him. As he buckled, she wrapped her good arm around his neck, dragging him down into the dust. In one fluid motion, she jammed the muzzle of her Sig Sauer P226 under the lip of his gas mask, pressing the steel into his throat. "Drop it!" Vance screamed. Her voice was unrecognizable, a gravelly, demonic screech. The cleaner froze. "Contact!" the other cleaners shouted, spinning toward their leader. "Hold fire!" Brody roared, seeing the movement. Vance used the cleaner leader as a human shield, hauling him up as she stood. She swayed on her feet, blood dripping from her nose, her eyes wild and white in the mask of dirt. "Tell them," Vance hissed into the cleaner's ear. "Tell them to drop the guns, or I will paint this rock with your brains." The cleaner leader hesitated. "Do it!" Vance pressed the gun harder. "Stand down!" the leader choked out. "Team 2, stand down!" The 3 men in black hesitated, then slowly lowered their MP7s. Brody stared at the figure holding the hostage. For a second, he didn't recognize her. She looked like something the desert had chewed up and spat out. Her uniform was rags. Her arm was a black crust, but the eyes, fierce, intelligent, lethal, were hers. "Elara," Brody whispered. "Get the bird on the ground, Lieutenant," Vance said, her voice dropping to a flat, professional tone despite the shaking of her hands. "We're leaving." "You heard her," Brody shouted, snapping back to reality. "Why, Jackson, disarm these assholes! Miller, get the medics!" The SEALs surged forward, zip-tying the cleaners, stripping their weapons. The tension broke, replaced by frantic motion. Vance didn't let go of the leader. She kept the gun pressed to his throat until Brody was standing right next to her. "I got him, Elara," Brody said softly, putting a hand on her shoulder. I got him. You can let go. Vance looked at Brody. The adrenaline crash hit her all at once. The world turned gray. She holstered her weapon, her fingers stiff. They tried to erase me, Brody, she whispered, leaning into him as her legs gave out. I know, Brody said, catching her before she hit the ground. He scooped her up, cradling her against his chest armor. I know. He turned to the Chinook. Get us out of here. Now! As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the disarmed cleaners in the dust of the crater, Vance looked out the back ramp. She watched the Devil's Anvil recede into the darkness. She was alive, but the war wasn't over. Holloway was still in the chair, and ghosts didn't rest until the haunting was done. 2000 Zulu, Al-Sara Air Base, Allied TOC status, mutiny in progress. Medical condition, critical, the wheels of the MH-47. Chinook touched the tarmac with a screech of rubber. The ramp dropped before the rotors had even begun to spool down. Waiting for them was a wall of light. Floodlights from 3 Humvees blinded the exit. Behind the lights stood a dozen military police officers, weapons drawn but pointed at the ground, and Colonel Holloway. Holloway looked immaculate. His uniform was pressed, his boots polished. He stood with the arrogance of a man who believed he controlled the narrative. Arrest them, Holloway ordered, his voice amplified by a megaphone. Lieutenant Brody and the members of Viper Team are to be taken into custody for mutiny, theft of government property, and unauthorized combat operations. Brody stepped down the ramp first, his hands raised but empty. He looked exhausted, his face caked in dust. Colonel, we need medical. We have a wounded operator. The medical team will attend to the prisoner after they are secured, Holloway barked. Get on your knees, Lieutenant. Brody didn't kneel. He stepped aside. From the dark cavern of the helicopter's bay, Elara Vance emerged. She didn't look human. She looked like a revenant dredged from a mass grave. Her left arm was strapped to her chest with duct tape and bloody gauze. Her face was a mask of soot, dried blood, and peeling skin. Her uniform was shredded, revealing the raw burns and cuts of 3 days in hell. She limped down the ramp, refusing the helping hand of the medic next to her. The MPs hesitated. The sight of her, the dead woman walking, sucked the air out of the confrontation. They lowered their weapons instinctively. Chief Vance, Holloway said. His voice faltered for a fraction of a second, then hardened. You are under arrest for desertion and failing to report. Vance didn't stop. She walked straight toward the Humvees, her boots dragging slightly on the asphalt. She walked past the MPs, who parted like the Red Sea. She walked right up to Holloway. The colonel was 6 feet tall. Vance stood 5'4". But in that moment, she towered over him. Desertion, Vance rasped. Her voice was like grinding glass. You went off grid, Holloway said, recovering his composure. You jeopardized this operation, and your team went rogue to fetch a corpse. I have something for you, Colonel, Vance said. She reached into her pocket with her good hand. The MPs tensed, hands hovering over their sidearms. She pulled out the battered ICOM radio she had taken from the wadi. She also pulled out a small, tangled wire, an aux cord she had ripped from the helicopter's comms panel during the flight back. Take her into custody, Holloway screamed, realizing the game was shifting. Let her speak, Brody shouted, stepping forward. His team formed a wedge behind him, weapons low but ready. The standoff was back on. Vance ignored the shouting. She walked to the nearest Humvee, the one with the comms relay system that fed directly into the base-wide PA and the JOC speakers. The sergeant in the driver's seat looked at her, terrified. "Plug it in," she ordered softly. The sergeant looked at Holloway, then back at the woman who smelled of cauterized flesh and death. He made his choice. He took the cable and plugged the ICOM into the vehicle's patch panel. Vance pressed the playback button on the voice recorder she had spliced into the radio's output. Static hissed over the tarmac speakers. Then a voice boomed out. Clear, undeniable. Viper 1 is classified KIA. The extraction was compromised. Intelligence indicates the asset was executed. We cannot risk another airframe for a body recovery. Holloway's face went pale. The recording continued. The drone pilot's voice. Requesting permission to investigate. And then, Holloway again. Colder, sharper. Negative, Reaper. Your orders are to sanitize the intelligence leak. If you see movement in that sector, it is hostile. You are free to engage. The silence that followed was louder than the Chinook's rotors. Every MP, every mechanic, every pilot on the flight line stared at Holloway. The order wasn't just a refusal to rescue. It was an assassination order. He had ordered a JDAM on a U.S. service member to cover up a botched intel report. That is doctored, Holloway stammered, backing away. That is insurgent propaganda. Vance unplugged the radio. She turned to the lead MP, a captain. "Captain," Vance said, her eyes boring into him. "I am Chief Petty Officer Elara Vance. I am reporting for duty, and I am accusing Colonel Holloway of conspiracy to commit murder and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 118. The captain looked at Holloway, then at Vance. He holstered his pistol. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. He turned to the colonel. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to surrender your sidearm." "You can't be serious," Holloway shrieked. "She's lying. She's compromised." "Sir," the captain said, his voice hard, "surrender the weapon. Now." Holloway looked around. He saw the disgust in the eyes of his own men. He saw Brody's team watching him with predatory stillness. He saw Vance swaying on her feet, but unbroken. Slowly, trembling, Holloway unbuckled his holster and handed the gun to the MP. "Get him out of my sight," Vance whispered. As they dragged Holloway away, the adrenaline finally ran out. The cable holding Vance upright snapped. Her eyes rolled back, and she pitched forward toward the asphalt. Brody caught her. "Medic!" he screamed. "Get the stretcher, now!" The world dissolved into a blur of lights and voices. But the last thing Vance heard wasn't the sound of bombs or orders. It was the sound of her team surrounding her, a shield of bodies that no enemy could penetrate. "We got you, Elara." Brody's voice floated in the darkness. "You're home." She let go. The ghost could finally sleep. 3 months later, the Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia status, civilian pending. The air conditioning in the Pentagon was too cold. It felt sterile, recycled, and dead. Nothing like the living, breathing heat of the Sahel. Chief Petty Officer Elara Vance sat in the anteroom of the Chief of Naval Operations office. She wore her dress blues, the fabric stiff and uncomfortable. Her left arm was in a sling, hidden discreetly under the jacket. But the shape was wrong. The skin grafts were still healing, a patchwork of tight, shiny tissue that pulled every time she took a deep breath. She looked at her reflection in the glass of a framed painting of a battleship. Her face was different. The desert had stripped away the softness. Her eyes were older, lined with the kind of fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. "Chief Vance? The Admiral will see you now." Vance stood up. She didn't smooth her uniform. She just walked. Inside, the office was mahogany and leather, smelling of lemon polish and old power. Admiral Sterling stood behind his desk. He was a good man, or so the file said, the man brought in to clean up Holloway's mess. "Chief," Sterling said, coming around the desk to shake her hand. He hesitated when he saw the sling, then offered a respectful nod instead. "Please sit." Vance remained standing. "I prefer to stand, sir." "Very well." Sterling leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "I've read the report, all of it. The unredacted version." "Then you know Holloway is going to prison," Vance said flatly. "He is. 20 years at Leavenworth. The court-martial was swift. We don't like dirty laundry, Chief, but we despise traitors even more." Sterling picked up a velvet box from his desk. He held it with reverence. "The President wants to award you the Medal of Honor, Elara, for actions above and beyond, for the intelligence you gathered that dismantled Malik's network, for saving the village of Al-Fashir." Vance looked at the box. It was the highest honor a soldier could receive. It was the dream of every recruit who stepped off the bus at Great Lakes. "No," Vance said. The Admiral blinked. "Excuse me." "I said no, sir." Vance's voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "That medal is for heroes. Heroes are people who die for a cause they believe in. I didn't fight for the Navy that day. I fought because your colonel left me to rot. I fought out of spite. I killed 38 men because I wanted to come home to my daughter." "Elara," Sterling sighed, his tone softening. "The country needs this. The Navy needs this. We need to show that even when the system breaks, the operator prevails." "The system didn't break, Admiral. It worked exactly as designed. It calculated my value against a political risk and decided I was expendable. I survived the calculation." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her discharge papers. Signed. "I'm done, sir. I'm taking the medical retirement." Sterling looked at her for a long time. He saw the steel in her spine, the unyielding wall she had built around herself. He slowly closed the velvet box and set it down. "We're going to miss you, Vance. You're a Tier 1 asset. There are other agencies, private firms, places where the rules are different." "I know," Vance said. "That's why I'm leaving." She turned on her heel. She didn't salute. She wasn't Navy anymore. She walked out of the office, past the secretaries, past the security checkpoints, and out into the gray, drizzling afternoon of Virginia. Lieutenant Brody was waiting for her by her car. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, and a leather jacket. He looked different, too. The weight was gone from his shoulders. "You take it?" Brody asked, leaning against the hood. "Told them to keep it," Vance said, unlocking the door. Brody smiled. It was a real smile, reaching his eyes. "Good. Would have looked tacky on you anyway." He opened the door for her. "The guys are at the bar. Miller's buying. He says he owes you about 1,000 beers." "Tell them I'll take a rain check," Vance said. "I have a soccer game to get to." Brody nodded. He reached out and touched her good shoulder. A gentle, grounding contact. "We're here, Elara. Always. You need anything? You call on the personal line. No radios." "No radios," she agreed. She got into the car and drove away. She watched Brody disappear in the rearview mirror, a sentinel of a life she was leaving behind. An hour later, she was sitting on the sidelines of a muddy field in the suburbs. The whistle blew. A swarm of 7-year-olds chased a ball. Among them, a girl with messy pigtails and a fierce determination was elbowing a boy twice her size. "Maya, pass it!" Vance yelled, cupping her hands. Maya looked up. She saw her mother. She grinned, a gap-toothed flash of pure joy, and kicked the ball toward the goal. Vance sat back on the cold metal bench. The rain was falling harder now, soaking her civilian coat. She closed her eyes. She listened. She could hear the traffic on the highway. She could hear the parents chatting about bake sales. She could hear the wet thud of the soccer ball. But underneath it all, she could still hear the silence of the desert. She could feel the weight of the rifle. She knew that the ghost hadn't stayed in Sector 4. The ghost had come home with her. She opened her eyes and scanned the perimeter of the park. She checked the sightlines. She noted the exits. She assessed the man standing by the tree line in a trench coat. She wasn't paranoid. She was prepared. The Navy thought she was retired. Holloway thought she was a victim. The world thought she was a survivor. They were all wrong. She was the one who made it out of the grave. And if anyone, anywhere, ever tried to threaten what was hers again, if they ever tried to sacrifice her or the people she loved, they would find out that the desert was just a training ground. Elara Vance smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. She was just getting started.